Mike and I want to go over now the pieces that we would incorporate, or the stroke pattern that would be the stack and tilt swing. We're going to start with the setup and go through the individual elements of the setup, go throughout the course of the backswing, the downswing, the impact, and the follow through of the basic motion for the stack and tilt. Mike, you want to start with the setup?
And as I'm describing the setup, I want to also mention that this is for a fairly straight to slight draw bias shot.
Okay.
So the first thing in my setup, I'm going to put my weight 55-45 forward at address.
Okay.
The center of my hips and shoulders are in line with the golf ball.
How about the location of the handle, Mike?
Handle slightly forward.
And it's forward to the point that it's lined up on the inside part of the left leg. Okay. Now, how about the height of the club? The height of the club would be like a good basic reference would be the base of the zipper. Okay, and then you'll also notice that Mike's arms are straight here, okay, as viewed from the front. And then Mike, speak just a little bit about the tilt in your shoulders, or lack thereof.
Well, at address, I try to keep my shoulders fairly level, 0 to 5 degrees of tilt. If I keep tilting my upper body further and further back, the center of my shoulders, regardless how much weight I have on my front foot, the center of my shoulders is further back behind the golf ball. So I want to get these 2 points almost right on top of one another. The middle of my hips, the middle of my shoulders. And in that case, there would be very little shoulder tilt.
Okay, now as viewed from the back, you'll also see that Mike's torso is flexed forward. Okay, you see that his ankles, his knees and ankles are flexed forward. And I think it's important to note here too that if you look carefully at his knees, that the feet are turned outward and the knees are turned outward too. The knees are not turned out past the feet, but they're turned out almost the same amount as the feet are. They're not square to the target. So to simplify, or to work our way back, starting from the ground up, the feet are rotated out 15 to 20 degrees as a baseline. Okay, the front foot in this case is a little bit more. The knees are rotated outward as well. As we work our way up to the hips are nearly level. Okay, the positioning of the shoulder, of the axis of the shoulder turn, is over top of the ball. The tilt in the shoulders is 0 to 5 degrees. Okay, and the height of the butt of the club is, as a baseline, the base of the zipper. Okay, any other elements you'd like to include on that? How about the tilt of the head, Mike?
Well, you notice my neck is tilted down and my back is not straight here. My back's straight, my chin was, if it was up, first of all, I'd have to stretch my eyes and my sockets just to keep my sight on the golf ball. My neck has to be tilted down so my central vision's on the golf ball. And the other thing the neck tilt does is help turn the shoulders, or help the shoulders turn on a steeper angle.
So by tilting your neck forward, you're able to see the ball in the center of your vision, and it also helps the trajectory of the left shoulder on the backswing. You also made a point here that there's no deliberate attempt to keep the back completely straight. You'll notice that Mike's shoulders are actually rounded inward here. They're not back. Okay, they're actually, the clavicles are actually forward. So you see how his shoulders are rotated inward, his upper body is tilted forward and it's not in a straight line. His head and neck is tilted down. His overall weight on the feet is, what would you say, Mike?
It's like balls of the feet and forward 55-45 on my left.
Okay.
Here are some comparisons of the hip location and handle location in the swing. As we go from the left to the right, you notice how the handle of the club, or the hands, are moved more and more forward, and also the hips are more forward as we go left to right.
It's no coincidence that the players on the left, with the handle back, the ball forward, and the hips relatively back more, are the most proficient faders or slicers or cutters of the golf ball. And as you move across the page, with the handle more forward and the weight more forward, enabling the golfer to hit out at the ball more, you find players who are more proficient at drawing the ball. Those would be the elements, the basic elements of the stack and tilt setup. So now we're going to begin the backstroke sequence. Mike, will you just narrate then the movement in order of your body throughout the course of the backswing?
My torso is beginning, as soon as I start my swing, it's tilting sideways to the left.
Here's a spectrum of the degree of freedom downward of the left shoulder as controlled by the spine tilting to the left on the backswing. Mike and I have made a point numerous times on this DVD that this is one of the distinguishing characteristics from the worst players to the best players. If you look at the players on the left, the champions, you can see that the left shoulder is moving downward. The spine is beginning to tilt to the left. In the middle, we have included what we interpret as the stack and tilt. You'll notice the similarities in those three pictures. The left shoulder down, the spine tilting to the left, the axis of the shoulder turns stable. As you look at the two pictures on the right, you'll notice that the left shoulder moves inward more and downward less. This causes the center of the shoulder turn to move back, pulling the head backward and upward on the backswing.
As it's tilting sideways, my knee flex changes, my left knee flexes, my right leg straightening, allowing my hands to move inward.
So Mike's hands are moving three dimensions here. They're moving backward, upward, and inward all at the same time. Okay, that's important to understand. Backward, upward, and inward on a tilted angle all at the same time. So we're clear. The side tilt to the left gives the ascent. Okay, the inward motion is powered by the turning of the hips and torso. So we have forces in two directions moving this club back, up, and in on the plane. Okay, so you got a side tilt to the left, you got the left knee flexing, the right knee straightening. And as you're doing that, Mike, what are you doing with your arms?
They're just staying on my body.
Okay, so the points, we'll refer to them, the Golfing Machine book refers to a term called pressure points, which we like to talk about for the arms on the torso. So the arms on the torso, staying on the torso, would be called the pressure points. And when you swing back, as the player begins side tilting, flexing and straightening his knees, the pressure points of the arms on the torso are staying. He is not lifting his arms off of his torso. Now, by doing that, as Mike side tilts, flexes his knee, straightens his leg, turns his hips, his hands then move in a trajectory around his body on an inclined angle. Some good references for that, if someone were to watch, if Mike goes back, is as he side tilts, flexes his knee, straightens his right knee, turns his hips, his hands will pass through the base, a little bit more please, the base to the middle of the bicep on the backswing. That would be a nice checkpoint for a person to start to measure the trajectory of the hand path. Where it passes through would be the base to the middle of the bicep. Okay, now, as Mike goes back again, Mike, you want to narrate what's happening with the shaft?
Well, the shaft is also moving on a plane. At address, there's a line here that goes through right around my zipper here. As I turn back, the shaft is staying on that incline up to a certain point. When it gets about halfway back here, because my right arm's folding, that shaft plane raises up a little bit higher. So now it's on an elbow plane.
Okay, and Mike, whenever you, as your hands are moving back on that trajectory, would you also discuss how the wrists work?
The wrists are hinging as I go back.
Okay, and at what rate would you say? Explain that.
They're only hinging at the same rate I'm turning and tilting my body.
Okay, so if one set up with the wrist angle at, say, an angle here of 135 degrees or so, throughout the course of his backswing, it would go 134, 33, 32, 31, 30, 29, 28, 27, 26, 25, 24, 23. He would be hinging that club evenly throughout the course of his backswing. He would not be, as he swings back, going halfway back. He would not be going back to 90 and then going, continuing to turn. The wrist cock would be incrementally the same as the backswing. Okay, So now we went over the setup. We've introduced the basic motion of the backswing with respect to how the sequence is. Will you just talk to me a little bit about the weight distribution at the setup and on the backswing?
At address, my weight's for this basic or standard shot, my weight's 55-45 forward. As I turn to the top, my weight's going from 55-45 to 60-40 at the top of my swing.
In which direction?
Left. So it's going just a little bit more forward as I'm turning back.
So your lower body is moving just a little bit more forward, moving the weight to 60-40 on your left at the top of your backswing with your lower body, correct?
Yes.
Okay, and then as you're doing that with the lower body going very, very slightly forward, explain to me what's happening with your side tilt and your shoulder turn as you go back.
My shoulders are going to turn in a circle to keep that same inclination from the ground. I've got a side tilt to the left and raise my spine up. So as at the same rate my weight's going slightly forward and I'm turning, I'm side tilting and raising my spine angle to 0.
That's allowing his left shoulder to move uniformly downward and inward throughout the course of his backswing. If at any point throughout the course of his backswing Mike stops tilting to the left, okay, then the axis of the shoulder turn will translate or move back, and the shoulder will immediately flatten out its trajectory. Okay, so it's important for you to understand then that the side tilt doesn't happen all at once. If it did, the head would move forward. The side tilt happens incrementally, evenly throughout the course of the backstroke so that the axis of the shoulder turn stays stable and the head stays still. If one's tilted to the left too fast, their head would go forward. If one did not tilt to the left fast enough, their head would go back. If one tilted to the left and did not release their forward tilt, their head would go forward and downward. Okay, and if one did not tilt to the left enough, what would happen, Mike?
Your head would raise up.
Your head would raise up. Exactly. Okay.
I'd like to add one point on this backswing, and it's just the flexion in the elbows here.
Okay.
Or the arms. On the backstroke, the right arm's flexing to 90 degrees and the left arm's staying straight. If the right arm starts to flex too far, the elbows begin to come apart too far, both arms start to bend.
And now, in that case, oftentimes what you see is as the elbows pull apart, okay, the effective wrist cock reduces. And this is the preliminary move in most people, a preliminary move in a lot of people's casting of the club, is they don't see it, but it's actually already happening on the backswing. When the elbows start to overflex and pull apart, the wrists actually uncock. So it's important for you to understand that the right arm's flexing to 90 degrees, okay, and that's helping the wrist angles to stay increasingly throughout the backswing and remain intact at the top of the backswing.
Now from the top, my shoulder's turning in a circle, my weight's 60-40 forward, my knee flex has changed, my hands have moved inward.
Your hips have turned on a tilted angle.
On the downstroke, my weight starts moving forward. So at the top of my swing, the weight's 60-40. When my arms are parallel to the ground on my downswing, the weight is now 70-30.
And Mike's referring to the weight of his lower body. So the weight's beginning to move forward with his lower body, correct, Mike?
Yes.
Okay, so continue.
So the top 60-40, when arms are parallel to the ground, it's 70-30. Club shaft gets to parallel to the ground, 80-20. Impact, 90-10. Follow through, arms parallel to the ground, 95-5.
Here's a catalog of the left knee motion as we begin the downswing. As we've noted earlier, the poorer player, as the downswing begins, straightens the front leg too quickly and the hips do not go forward long enough. This page was made to illustrate how the left knee moves forward and actually oftentimes downward slightly as the downswing begins.
Here's a sequence of a number of different players illustrating the start of the downswing all the way through to the finish. You notice how the left knee is flexed and remains flexed and does not begin to straighten until just prior to impact.
The point Mike and I would like to make here, again, is that the left knee moves forward. You'll notice in the third picture from the right that it is in front of the ankle. The fourth picture from the right, it is still flexed in front of the ankle. And as we arrive at impact, the left leg is beginning to straighten, but is in front of the left ankle. Finally, as we arrive up to the finish, the hips have pushed forward, the left leg is straightened, the belt is raised, and the spine is extended.
And then the last piece would be the through swing, and I would just explain it as pushing or extending the hips forward through to the finish.
But as Mike's hips move forward, okay, if he doesn't extend his spine, okay, Mike, move your hips forward. Okay, now, you see how he's staying bent over and trying to move his hips forward, like that. This swing, if a person did this, okay, the center of the shoulder turn would start moving forward, which would slow the club down. So as Mike pushes his hips forward, now will you extend? Watch him. You can see him extending his spine. Okay, one more time like that, Mike. Keep the same flex forward, please. Okay, now one more time. Please keep the same flex forward on the follow through. Now show us what it would look like if you did it correctly, just right there. Keep extending it, keep going. That would be the correct motion there. You can see very clearly, I think, just looking at that follow through, how Mike went from a person who stayed in the same flex to extending the spine coming through the ball. Okay, so now the whole golf swing then can be said in its simplest terms like this. Weight forward, hands in, shoulder down, hips forward on the finish, like that. That would be the basic biomechanical moves for a structurally sound golf swing.
Right. Even if someone thought about those things, did a little bit better, and they still had some problems, they would not change those pieces. So there's more detail, but those pieces would stay there regardless of how they were hitting the golf ball.
And I would like for Mike to just talk a little bit about that, because in Mike's development as a golfer, he would learn these basic pieces, and then the ball would go crooked, and he would go back and try to change his basic pieces when all he really needed was a little more sophistication, not changing the basic pieces that he had already started with.
Right.
Correct?
Correct.
So the idea is that you learn the basic pieces first, and throughout the course of our explanation, we'll keep adding and layering in more and more sophistication so that the golfer, as he progresses, can explain his problems more thoroughly and help themselves to see more and more of the picture as we go along. The game of golf has been played for a long time, and a lot of time and effort has been put into learning how to hit this ball. A lot of that put in by Mike and I as well. Mike and I would like to talk to you, or talk to everyone, about the progression with learning how to hit a ball. The first thing a person would want to learn when they try to learn how to play golf would be the fundamentals. And the question that Mike and I would like to pose is, what are the fundamentals? Mike, what would you say?
Well, I was brought up believing that the fundamentals were the grip, the stance, posture, ball position, alignment. I spent hours working on those pieces of my swing. What we later found out is that all the great players, a lot of very good players, all have different variations. No one has a standard grip, posture, ball position, or alignment.
For instance, in the grip, Ben Hogan, one of the game's great players, had a grip that was nearly vertical to the ground with his left hand. It was not turned hardly any degrees. Whereas Sam Snead, when he held the club, his hand was turned inward 45, 60, 70 degrees. Okay, so you see the best players, Lee Trevino had a grip that was rotated. The best players employed different degrees of rotation in their hands. They also link their hands together in different ways. Harry Vardon prescribed the Vardon grip, which was an overlapping grip, and Jack Nicklaus had an interlocking grip. And there have been players who played the tour with cross-handed grips, split grips. So there's been all types of grips that the game's best players have employed. The piece to learn from that is that the grip in and of itself, there are no similarities in the game's best players.
Right, no standard, and that goes to along with how the player stood towards the golf ball or addressed the golf ball. Sam Snead was bent much more forward than, say, Ben Hogan or Jack Nicklaus.
So the best players had different grips and they had different stances. How about the alignment, Mike? Where did they aim?
Well, Snead aimed to the right, Nicklaus aimed to the left, Trevino aimed to the left.
How about the alignment of the club face? Aim at the target. That's one of the oldest pieces and standards in learning how to play the game. How many players do you think actually aim at the target?
0.
Okay.
They aim in a general direction to suit the shape of shot they expect to play. We've got some players, Steve Elkington's aiming the club face 30 degrees to the right, Paul Azinger's aiming the club face to the left.
So what you're saying then is that all the pieces that a person would learn how to play, the pieces with which a person would traditionally learn how to play with, the grip, stance, the alignment, there's no common denominators exhibited by the game's best players.
Correct.
Anything else you'd like to add to that?
Ball position.
Ball position would be another one. And can you demonstrate that, please, Mike?
There's some players play the ball back in their stance.
Who might that be?
Tom Lehman, Alan Doyle. You've got other players that have the ball position much further forward, like Craig Stadler or Ian Leggett. Some players like that with the ball position way forward of their stance.
So we have different grips, we have different stances, we have different alignments, we have different postures, we have different ball locations. All these pieces. How about the tempo, Mike?
All kinds of different tempos. So that's not a common link that ties all the good players together.
What would you say about the comparison between the tempo of Fred Couples' swing versus Nick Price's swing?
Two ends of the spectrum there. Both very good players, but both have very different tempos.
And often when you see poorer players hit a ball and they hit a bad shot, what's the first thing they say?
I swung too fast.
Got too quick?
Too quick.
Too quick. And a lot of times people, because they don't know really what to say or how to explain their problems, latch on to some of these what would you say?
Catchphrases.
Pseudo mechanics, catchphrases, to blame their bad shots on. What Mike and I would like to do here is to actually go over in order the things that the best players actually do in common. What is the progression for the beginner to learn how to hit a ball? Okay.
So that would lead us to the first piece that links all the people that can play the game at a high level together.
Would that be the grip, the stance, the alignment, the posture?
No, the first thing that links them all together is their ability to hit the ground in the same spot every time. As you go down the handicaps from a 36 handicap to a 20 handicap, that dispersion on the ground gets better.
For instance?
As if you gave a 36 handicapper a club and asked them to hit this line here, if they hit the ground at all, most of the time they'd hit somewhere behind the golf ball, sometimes a few feet behind the ball, sometimes just an inch behind the ball. But again, the dispersion behind the golf ball, you'd see all sorts of marks back here. If I were to practice and stand here and make practice swings, the club would hit the ground in front of that line every time.
Okay.
Well, to become a good player and keep improving, that would be the first thing I would measure in a player, is their ability to hit the same spot every time. Not how they held the club or aimed, but their ability to hit the ground and hit it in front of the golf ball.
Okay, so if you hit this ball, okay, where would the divot be?
Divot's going to be in front of the line.
Okay. And if you stood here all day and hit balls, how many times would the divot be behind that line?
0.
0, right. There's Mike hitting 17 shots with 17 divots in front of the line. Okay, so the point that we want to impress upon one here is that the first thing that starts to unite all the game's best players is their ability to hit the ground in the same spot.
Correct.
Okay, now second, Mike, what would you say the next piece is that a person has to do or that would unite all the best players?
The ability to have enough power, hit the ball far enough to play the course with a reasonable amount of strokes.
Okay, so what you're saying is that you can't just hit the ground in the same spot and just chip the ball. You have to have a swing that hits the ground in the same spot but generates enough power so that you can hit the ball far enough to play the course.
Correct.
And okay, and then finally, Mike, then third, what would be the third thing that a person would have to do to play great golf?
Then the last piece would be how you control the golf ball's curvature.
Okay.
Hitting the ball in some sort of pattern or a predictable pattern.
So some sort of predictable pattern will be the third thing in order that the best players can do. It's our belief that you can shorten your learning curve or your entry into golf and learning how to play by learning the correct order to A, hit the ground in the same spot, B, hit at the ground in the same spot with enough power to play effectively, and C, hit the ground in the same spot with enough power and a predictable curve. Correct?
Correct.
So, Mike, to hit the ground in front of the ball, would you then just explain the technique and how you're using your weight to control where the club hits the ground?
Okay, first what I have to do is control my weight. And when I talk about that, I'm looking at 2 points, the middle of my shoulders and the middle of my hips. If I move either one of those centers back, like many of us are taught to do, load up your right side, the club tends to hit the ground further back behind the line.
Mm-hmm.
If I move my weight, if I have it set up where it's a little bit forward at address, say 55-45 forward on my left foot here, and I move it even further forward, say 60-40,
Yep.
and from there I move forward from that point, I can hit the ground much further forward of that line.
Okay, so listen close. What Mike's saying here is that first, the biggest, most distinguishable difference between good players and bad is the precision with which they hit the ground and where they hit the ground. The poor player hits the ground behind the ball. The good player hits the ground in front of the ball. Now, then for the player to move that point forward, to be able to hit the ground more forward, Mike is saying that he moves his weight more forward.
Now,
Mike, this has far-reaching implication because the technique with the way golf has been taught traditionally was to, on the backswing, shift the weight back and then move the weight forward. But you're saying the beginning player can learn to hit the ground in front of the line faster, easier, by shifting the weight which direction on the backswing?
forward.
Shifting the weight forward on the backswing.
And forward on the downswing, further forward on the follow through. So it's continuously going forward, not ever going back.
Okay.
That'd be the easiest way to hit the ground in the same spot. Not the only piece, but it's the starting point.
So that would be the starting point for making the bottom of the swing be in front of the ball. Correct?
Right.
Okay. To help illustrate our point about the low point being behind the ball being the first fundamental, Mike and I have included a catalog of pictures illustrating our point.
This is just a sample of 18 pictures of people hitting the ground behind the golf ball. We've got tens of thousands of them cataloged in our books.
To make this point clearer, we just took 4 pictures for you to take a closer look at, so that you can see clearly the bottom of the club being behind the ball. Mike and I have discussed the two primary pieces that are in control of this.
One being where the weight is, if it's far enough forward or not, and where the handle location is. Is it forward or is it back?
And finally, the third picture that we've included is what we call a spectrum, and it's a comparison of where the club is hitting the ground. On the left of the screen, you'll see that the club is hitting the ground the farthest behind the ball, and progressively as we go across the page, you'll see the bottom or the point where the club is hitting the ground progressively farther forward as you cross the page.
All were fat shots, however.
The second piece in controlling where the club hits the ground is what the golfing machine and Andy and I refer to as a flying wedge, or the angle between the shaft and the right arm here.
Would you like to use me as the ground and demonstrate
Yes.
that?
If Andy's the ground and I push the handle of my club forward like this, you notice how the club head moves away from Andy's chest,
So, one
or
more
away
time.
from the ground.
So as Mike's pushing his handle forward, one more time please, Mike. The circumference of the swing is getting shorter. It would never reach the ground, correct? Or it wouldn't reach the ground until the point that the club caught up with the arm. Okay, that would be the longest point of the swing, the widest point of the arc. So the more that Mike's handle stays ahead of the club, the shorter the circumference of the swing is getting. So if Mike keeps his hands ahead of the club and swings, okay, one more time, hard, he would never hit me. One more time, please, Mike. Harder. Okay, but if for whatever reason, if Mike swung back, okay, had his hands ahead of the club, the right wrist bent, and he came through and the wrist uncocked, don't swing hard, okay, then you can see where the club would hit the ground farther back on the ground. Okay.
Now if I also moved my weight back and started to unhinge my wrists, I would hit the ground the furthest back.
Here's 4 players demonstrating the flying wedge, keeping their right wrist bent so that the club hits the ground in front of the ball.
You'll notice we have the flying wedge highlighted with a yellow arrow. The point of this catalog is to help one see how the flying wedge helps to make the angle of descent steeper and to help move the bottom of the swing forward. If one were to take this catalog and compare it to an earlier catalog we showed of 18 amateur golfers, the difference would be very apparent in the A, yellow arrow or the flying wedge, and B, where the club is hitting the ground. Okay, would you demonstrate that from this angle, Mike? So if you did both of the pieces, the weight moving back and the wrists uncocking, the club would hit where?
Behind my right foot.
The farthest back. Okay, demonstrate that, please. Okay, now if you did both of the pieces that make you hit the ground the furthest forward, what would that look like?
Okay, I'm going to move my weight further forward and keep my wrist angles.
And you can see on the ground the dispersion here, or the variance in with where Mike's club hit the ground. It's almost the whole length of the club. And he's demonstrating there to you very clearly how the weight moving forward and the hands being ahead of the club, keeping this angle in the right wrist frozen, is helping Mike to hit further and further forward on the ground. Okay, now, how would you say those two pieces relate to in importance in learning how to play?
Number one.
Number one.
Number one.
Number one.
That's
Okay.
going to be the basic principle you'd need to understand or be able to perform to play all the basic shots.
Okay.
From chipping, pitching, full shots.
Okay. So now we've went over two primary pieces to help the player evaluate where they're and control where they're hitting the ground. Now, Mike, we also mentioned though, but to play good golf, you had to be able to hit the ground in front of the ball, but you also had to start to hit the ball far enough to play the course.
Exactly. So now we'll go over the pieces that would help you hit the ball far enough. Starting with the path of my hands, or moving my hands inward in a circle versus a back in a straight line.
Okay, and it's important to remember that when we play golf, because of the way the clubs are built, they're tilted, that we play golf on a tilted angle like this, okay? And because the angle is tilted, then what that means is that the path of the hands and the path of the club have to make an arc. So when the golfer's standing over the ball, this is what he sees. This is the path of his hands, and this is the path of his club. So, okay, if you do that one more time, Mike, when Mike swings back, immediately as he swings back, the path of the hands do not go straight back any distance. Okay, they go back immediately in an arc. Okay, now the angle of that arc is the subject of a much more detailed conversation. It's our intent here to first get the most important pieces and layer in the sophistication as we go. Okay, so now we've established some pieces to control how to hit the ground, and now we're talking about how to start to generate the power with which to hit the ball a long way. And Mike is illustrating how the hands begin moving back in an arc or in a circle. Okay, Mike, what's that do for you?
Well, as soon as I move my hands inward, I'm using what's called, or a term called, angular momentum. I'm storing up some potential energy there.
And you see that, you see this illustration in all forms of sports and science and all over the world. What would be let's take the football player, Mike. Explain how the evolution of the kicker has demonstrated this.
Well, years ago, 30-yard field goal used to be a long field goal. Kickers kicked in a straight line like this.
It's like super toe.
Right. A few years ago, well, now quite a few years ago, the soccer players came over and started kicking the field goals, and now 60 yards is a long field goal. Where now they're using what the soccer players do, they turn at an angle and kick the goal.
And what's that allow them to do?
Power of a circle. Their foot is accelerating. It's not moving in a straight line,
Okay.
a linear force.
Okay, so what you're doing here is you're taking your hands and your club back in an arc, and it's so people shouldn't have the impression that they're supposed to take the club straight back. They're supposed to take the club and the handle back, okay, in an arc, in an arc on a tilted angle. Okay. To help us illustrate the importance of the hand path and that the hands travel in a circle, we have assembled a number of the game's greatest players.
On this page, you're looking at about 40 major championships. And notice how the left arm's inside the stance line on all of these pictures.
An easy way for you to measure that would be to watch where the hands pass through the body. And you'll see in these pictures, the hands are passing through at the base of the bicep. To further illustrate our point, we took another generation of golfers and another generation of major championship winners to help you to see very clearly the path of the hands. Again, the hands are passing through the base of the bicep, and the left arm is inside the line of the feet when it's parallel to the ground.
Here's another catalog of some of the players we teach, and notice again the similarities. When the left arm's parallel to the ground, the left arm's inside the stance line, and the hands are exiting about the elbow or just slightly above.
Now, that's the first piece that a person might do to start to generate some power in their stroke. Mike, would you talk a little bit about how the wrists might start to add a little bit of power in the stroke?
Well, on my backswing, I'm going to increase the wrist angle. That's another lever here, so I can hit the ball further. Without any wrist hinge, that you're just subtracting a potential source of power.
So as the golfer's level of sophistication increases, they acquire the ability to start to increase the wrists, cocking or hinging, okay, and still move the weight forward and hit the ground in front of the ball. Okay, go ahead, Mike. Okay, so where we're at is first we established some pieces that control where we hit the ground, and now we've introduced some basic pieces on how to start to generate some power on the club.
Right, and we talked about the hands need to move inward. To do that, there's a few other pieces that need to happen.
Okay,
It starts with, if I start from the ground up, start with my knees. On the backstroke, my right leg is straightening, my left knee is flexing. That's going to help my hands be able to move on an inward angle.
what happens if you don't flex your front knee and straighten your back knee and both knees stay flexed?
Well, first I'm limited of how far I can turn my hips, and my hips start to turn much more level to the ground. And we already explained we're hitting this golf ball on a tilted angle. I want to try and keep that same inclination with my body as I'm swinging the club.
So if you keep both knees flexed, how does that affect the ability to turn the hips and shoulders and the path of the hands?
Right, well, first, again, my hips and shoulders cannot turn as much. And when they stop turning, my hands and arms start lifting the club.
They start going straight up in the air
Right.
instead of on an incline. So the point there to understand is that if Mike's knees stop flexing and straightening, his hips will stop turning earlier, which will make his hands go straighter up. Okay, well, we just explained that golf is played on a tilted angle, and for the hands to keep going backward evenly on a tilted angle, he has to first flex and straighten his front and back leg. Here we have a catalog assembled illustrating the flexing of the front leg and the straightening of the back leg. But before we go into that, I'd like to take this opportunity to explain why we've taken the time and effort to illustrate to you these individual pieces of a swing. It's important as we learn how to play golf that the golfer learns to understand the function of each one of these individual elements. That's why we break down the swing the way we do.
In these pictures, you notice the similarities in the right leg and left knee flex, and also how much the hips have turned and what angle the hips turn on. Now, they're not all identical, but they are very similar.
Included on this page is nearly 50 major champions illustrating the concept that the front leg flexes, the back leg straightens, how that controls the angle the hips turn on and the degree the hips turn.
Now we're looking at 6 players we currently teach that are on the PGA Tour. And again, we're noticing how similar they all look in the degree of their knee flex, their hand pass, their hip tilt, their shoulder tilt.
As Mike mentioned, these pictures are now starting to look very similar. The basic structure of the stack and tilt is starting to emerge. That is, the flexing of the front leg, the straightening of the back leg, allowing the hips to turn on a tilted angle, and then the degree or the pitch of the shoulder turning plane. You're noticing here that the left shoulder is down, the right shoulder is up, the shoulders are turning on a tilted angle. That is controlled by the flexing of the front leg, the straightening of the back leg, combined with the spine tilting to the left. This is a good point or a good time to illustrate one of the major factors that separate expert players from poorer players, and that is the degree of freedom of the left shoulder downward. The expert player, through flexing the front leg and straightening the back leg and tilting the spine to the left on the backswing, is able to turn the left shoulder downward longer. The poorer player, who does not flex or straighten the knees correctly and does not tilt the spine correctly on the backswing, turns the shoulder too level to the ground, which pulls the axis of the shoulder turn and the head backward as viewed from the front. So one more time on the front leg, Mike. How does it go on the backswing?
It's flexing towards that target line or plane line.
Okay, and whenever you swing back again, please, Mike, how's the back leg acting?
It's straightening.
So the golfer should understand the way the legs work on the backswing is the front leg bends, the back leg straightens. Okay, now what's that allow the hips to do?
Turn more and turn on a tilted angle.
So as the golfer flexes and straightens his legs, it increases the degree of freedom for the hips to turn. Okay, now how does that affect the path of the hands, Mike?
It allows them to move inward.
Okay, and allows them to continue moving inward throughout the course of the backswing, because many times what happens to the golfer is at some point on the backswing, the leg stops flexing, the hip stops turning, that stops the shoulder from turning, which makes the hands start to lift upward. Okay,
Here we have a spectrum of the side tilt halfway back when the left arm's parallel to the ground. From the left to the right, you see the progression and how much side tilt there is, how low the left shoulder is to the ground, and also the degree that the hips are turning at.
you'll notice that in the picture on the right, the far right, the left shoulder has went downward more and inward less as compared to the other side of the spectrum. As the shoulder has went downward more and inward less, the center of the shoulder turn has not moved in the picture on the right. If you compare that all the way across the page to the picture on the left, you'll see that the golfer stayed or retained the forward tilt. Because there was no tilt of the spine to the left shoulder went inward more than downward, pushing the axis of the shoulder turn over the right foot. So, just to reiterate, the legs on the backswing, the front leg bends, the back leg straightens. That allows the hips to turn. Okay, the fact that the front leg is bending and the back leg is straightening not only allows the hips to turn, but it allows the hips to turn on a tilted angle. Okay, not if I keep both knees flexed, then my hips start turning on an angle that's too level to the ground. Okay, now we're just going to work our way upward and explain some of the basic pieces that the body does to help a person swing on this tilted angle. We started with the legs flexing and straightening. We worked our way up to how that allows the hips to turn on a tilted angle. Now we've worked our way up from the knees to the hips to the shoulders. Mike, how do the shoulders work to be able to first store power and second hit the ground in the same spot?
Well, first, to be able to do that consistently, my shoulders need to turn in a circle. They can't be moving back and forth like this if I expect to hit the ground in the same spot every time.
So if Mike were doing this just standing erect, he would want to turn the shoulders in a circle like this. What would it look like if it was incorrect, Mike? Okay, and if a person was moving the shoulder turn back as they turned, Mike? Okay, do it one more time. Everybody see me there? Okay, do it one more time, please. If a person were doing that, how would that affect their stroke?
Well, they'd be moving their center, their shoulder turn so far back, it'd make it very difficult to hit the ground in the right spot. They'd hit the ground further back behind the ball.
Okay, now talk a little bit about the ability to turn the shoulders in a circle, but from a tilted over position.
It's easy to do standing erect here, but to do it on this, from this setup that we have, we're bent forward, just using a number, say 40 degrees, for me to turn my shoulders in a circle and maintain this inclination forward, not raise up or tilt to the side here, something has to happen with my spine. It continuously has to change throughout the swing to keep that same inclination. So on the backswing,
okay,
the first thing that is happening is the spine's going from that 40-degree of flexion forward all the way to 0 at the top of the swing. However, it doesn't look that way when I hit a golf ball, because at the same rate I'm straightening from 40 to 0, my spine is tilting to the left.
And Mike, so what you're saying then is that to turn your shoulders in a circle, your spine is actually changing its flex, correct?
Correct.
Okay, that's what we want you to understand. This is how the name or the term stack and tilt came about, was our desire to express to someone how the body can turn the shoulders in a circle on a tilted angle. And what Mike's saying to do that is that when he swings back, he has to tilt his spine to the left as he swings back to be able to do that. So Mike, talk about the difficulty in seeing that in golf?
Well, many times I'll watch the players on the telecast, and the camera's not moving. It's just at this angle here, at right angles to the player, and they turn back, and some of them look like they're straight up and down or in line with the golf ball. To be able to see that angle or measure the change in that spine angle, the camera would have to move with the player to be able to pick that up.
Oh, okay. So what you're saying then is if a person actually, as you swung back, okay, moved with you like this, keep going, by the time they reached the top of your backswing, what the person would actually be looking at is a tilt to the side like this, right? That's turned 90 degrees. Pictured here is our friend Charlie Wee. You can see in the left picture is Charlie Wee when we first met him, and you can see that his shoulder turn moved back. You can see the left hip is higher than the right, and how the lower body weight is on the back, has moved to the back foot. Our friend Steve Elkington is helping Charlie in the middle picture, and you can see he's tilting Charlie's spine to the left on his backswing.
The picture on the right is actually a current picture of Charlie. And an interesting note in these pictures is that when we met Charlie, the pictures on the left, he had a hard time hitting the ball up in the air.
One would think that with the weight behind the ball, conventional wisdom says with the weight behind the ball, that the ball will go higher. If you compare the picture on the far right to the picture on the far left, you'll notice that A, the left shoulder has went down more. B, that the right hip is higher, indicating that the hips have turned on more of a tilted angle. C, that the left leg has flexed and the right leg has straightened. In other words, the left leg has went down more, enabling the right hip to go higher. The spine has tilted to the left more, like our friend Steve is showing Charlie in the middle picture, and that is enabling Charlie's shoulder to turn downward more. This goes to the point that we were making earlier about how the amateur golfer struggles with the degree of freedom of the left shoulder downward versus inward, and what that does to the axis of the shoulder turn.
In case Charlie forgets, here's a good example. Sam Snead, halfway back, you notice how the hip tilt, the shoulder plane, the knee flex, how everything's centered here.
In the 2005 PGA Championship at Baltusrol, Steve Elkington did numerous practice swings throughout the course of his round that resemble these practice swings of Sam Snead. That is, tilting the spine to the left to lower the left shoulder on the backswing.
If any of you have noticed any of our other players doing practice swings that look a bit unconventional, that's the reason behind it. They know from looking at their pictures that their head and shoulders are moving to the right, so they try and stretch the opposite direction to get a feel.
Okay, what would it look like, Mike, if you kept the same tilt?
If I kept that 40-degree tilt,
If you kept the same flex forward in the spine, what would it
and the
look
tilt
like?
to the right.
Okay, and then what would it look like coming through, just as an example? So it's important, just in your basic understanding of how to play golf, that you learn that the shoulders should turn in a circle first. That does a number of things. First, it helps to control where you hit the ground, and it's a preliminary piece in starting to generate some power. But the technique involved in turning the shoulders in a circle on a tilted angle is such that the spine has to simultaneously tilt to the left as it goes back.
As it raises up.
Well, as the spine raises up, it has to tilt to the left. We've made the point several times throughout the DVD about the spine tilting to the left. We also made the point that this is visible as the camera moves when the player turns throughout the course of the backswing. Mike and I have illustrated how the spine tilting to the left is what controls the downward portion of the left shoulder on the backswing. These pictures were shot at almost a 3/4 angle so that the golfer could see the spine tilting to the left, controlling the degree of freedom of the left shoulder down.
It is clear looking at these pictures that the players are not maintaining their spine angle, rather maintaining the inclination from the ground. Also, you'd note that if anything, the center of the shoulders is now forward of the center of the hip turn. Another illustration of this concept is found in Ben Hogan's 5 Fundamentals book. On pages 73 and 4, he draws a diagram with the turn of the shoulders and the turn of the hips at the top of the swing, and the centers of the shoulder are actually in front of the center of the hips.
So Mike, are you saying then that the golfer should get the shoulder turn behind the ball or behind the spine?
Absolutely not.
So then what you're saying is that the spine is changing its flex on the backswing. Is that correct?
Correct. If I was a player that tilted sideways, did the side tilt faster than I stood up, you'd see the head go forward and down. Okay. If I was a player that stood up faster than I did my side tilt, that's a player whose head is moving up and to the right.
Who would be an example of that? Anybody you can think of? Kenny Perry, maybe?
Mm-hmm. That's a good
Kenny
one.
Perry would be a good, Tom Shearer, a good example.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, and who would be now what would happen if you, go ahead, Mike, sorry.
Oh, that's fine. However, if I do this correctly, if my spine's straightening and tilting simultaneously, my head stays still.
Correct. Now, Mike, what would happen if, when you swung back, if your head or the center of your shoulder turn moved back? What would be involved in that?
That would be something like this, where I retain that original tilt. Never tilted sideways, did not straighten my spine at all.
Hence the term stack and tilt, where the golfer stacks his setup and tilts his spine to turn the shoulders in a circle. It's helpful to see the swing from a different perspective. Using the overtop view and the posterior view, now one will get a very clear view of the stack and tilt. So Mike, as Mike swings back, okay Mike, you'll see the simultaneous tilting to the left and standing up. Now, the way a person would learn to see this is that first, from this view, is if the person were to observe Mike's torso, and I just put a club along Mike's torso, do you see how it's tilted to the left? It is not vertical to the ground. Everybody see that? Now, if Mike swung back and he kept the same forward flexion in his spine, one would see that the axis of the shoulder turn moves back, and from the posterior view, one would see how the spine stays in the same flex, the same forward flex. Okay, one more time, please, Mike. Now, the simultaneous raising and tilting to the left allows the player to turn the shoulders in a circle. That's very important because that allows the player to hit the ground in the same spot every time and to start to develop a pattern with which to direct the path of the hands. Okay, now one more time, please, Mike. Very clearly then, the individual pieces are a simultaneous standing up and a side tilt to the left. If Mike were to only side tilt to the left when he swung back, one would see that the golfer's head went forward and downward. Okay? To keep the head from going forward and downward, as Mike tilts to the left, the initial forward bend comes out. And that's the extension you're seeing from the posterior view this way. Like a good analogy of that that we find helpful is the high jumper Dick Fosbury. You know, high jumping, in the Olympics for years and years and years, there was a certain threshold that jumpers jumped. And along came Dick Fosbury with a new technique, and he jumped substantially higher than all the jumpers before him. So they termed that the Fosbury flop.
Broke the record by a foot.
Yeah, he broke the Olympic record by a foot. Well, the technique that revolutionized his sport was the technique of going over the bar and extending the spine in this manner, which is exactly the manner that we're prescribing to allow the shoulders to turn in a circle on a tilted angle. A lot of times, actually, the players that we help on the tour will refer to this move as the stack and tilt or the Fosbury flop. Okay, one more time please, Mike. Okay, and again, to help a person see that, if I were to do it again please, Mike, you can see if we have a straight line here from Mike's right hip, how it's tilted this way. And we know that if Mike swings back and he only tilts forward or tilts to the left, that his head would go forward and downward. So we know to keep the level of his head the same, that he must be raising up. One more time, stay up. Okay, one more time. Now correctly, please. Went down just a hair, good. Perfect. Okay, and I want to make this point clear. If the center of this swing, okay, one more time please. The center of this shoulder turn actually moves back or translates, as they say in science. If the center moves back or translates, okay, how would a golfer recognize, first of all, that they were doing that? The answer to that would be, first you'd see the head start to move backward. So if you're swinging back and someone says your head is moving back, then you would know that your spine is not tilting to the left fast enough. Correct?
Correct.
Okay, and if your head actually moved forward, then you would know that your spine was tilting to the left too fast. And if you swung back and you kept the center stable, then you would know that you were simultaneously tilting the spine to the left and raising up at the same time. That's the way a person could easily recognize if in fact they were doing this. Next, the golfer needs to understand what the form does and how the ball flies, so that they can accurately understand what the correct focus of their swing is. And Mike is going to illustrate one concept here that we feel is very important. Just how important would you feel this is, Mike?
It's more important than having all the structure perfect.
So again, just to reiterate, this concept of where the weight is in relation to the golf ball is more important than all the other parts. Okay, so it's the most important piece. And Mike, would you demonstrate that?
Well, you could have all the nice form, the shoulders turning a circle, the weight staying centered and then moving forward, the swing plane perfect, but it's all relative to where that is in relationship to the ball and how you're aiming this club face now.
So what you're saying then is, Mike, the more you move your weight forward, okay, one more time please. The more you move your weight forward, what's that doing to your swing?
That's causing the club to swing further out at the ball, longer.
What Mike's saying is, the more he moves his weight forward, he's able to hit the ball on the back side of this circle and in effect swing out longer. That's very important to understand. Next,
if I move my weight back and I'm further back behind the ball,
for whatever reason,
the more the club would swing out across the golf ball.
And the earlier it would come across the ball. Okay, now, Mike, if we went back to the original, what would happen if your weight went forward, okay? Everybody can see this point is moving in front of the ball. That's going to enable Mike to hit out longer. So he's hitting the ball on the back side of the circle. And if that were the case, Mike, if you were hitting the ball with your weight in front of the ball, the center in front of the ball, okay?
I could push and draw the golf ball, depending on the face. I could push it and draw it.
Pushes and draws depending on the angle of the club face. Okay, now, Mike, what would happen to your ball if the weight was behind the ball?
With my weight behind the golf ball, I would just do the opposite. The more behind the ball I am, the more I'm going to pull or slice the golf ball.
Where this is very important is the amateur golfer or the prototypical slicer's problem is the weight is too far back, not forward, too far back. such that this point where the club hits the target is behind the ball, and they actually hit the ball on the forward side of the circle. Now, depending on the angle of the club face, but if the club face is held remotely in a square manner to the target, that produces a slice. And this is where a lot of the problems with golf instruction lies, is that the standard piece of one of the standard tenets of playing golf is to move your weight back on the backswing. Okay, and then on the downswing, many amateurs don't come forward fast enough, so their weight is too far behind the ball, therefore they hit across all the balls. Now, if you wanted to take someone, Mike, and in 3 swings teach them to hit a draw, what's the first thing you would do?
Move their weight the furthest forward.
Move
Put all their weight on their front side.
If a person wanted to hit a draw or a ball that curves to the left, the first thing that Mike would do, he just said, would be to move all the weight forward. And the principle that he's in control of or demonstrating is that this point where the club hits the target line, which we'll refer to as the point of tangency, this point would move forward. The more forward his weight moves, which enables him to hit the ball on the backside of the circle. What you as an average or as a beginning player, an intermediate player, an expert player, a professional should understand is where your weight is in relation to the ball and what side of the circle that's making you hit the ball on. That, I would say, is the most important thing, simply put, for a golfer to understand in playing golf. Okay, now this leads us to the next most important piece that a golfer needs to understand, and it is the most basic question about the initial direction of the ball, because Mike just explained to you how to control your swing path, which side of the circle you hit the ball on, okay? But now you have to understand, when you hit this ball, what controls its initial direction. And Mike and I have been talking to the best players in the world, and we asked them the most basic question, and that is, what controls the ball's start line? Is it the path or is it the face? And Mike, what would you say the results are?
Well, there's no consensus to begin with. Every other player you ask gives a different answer. But given the choice between the path or the face angle, 60% of the players roughly are saying it's the path of the club, 40% are saying it's the face angle. And now with today's high-speed cameras making it much easier to measure, we do know that it's the face angle controlling that initial start line.
So the point here is that the best players can project the ball where they want to, but they don't always accurately describe that, and therein lies the problem for people learning how to play. So we've laid out for you the piece that controls the path, okay? Now we're laying out for you what controls the initial direction, because, Mike, well, what does control the initial direction?
The face angle.
The club face. Okay, so the answer then is, when the ball is hit, its initial direction is directed by the angle of the face, where the face is pointed. Okay? The ball's curve, whenever it curves through the air, is controlled by the angle of the face's relationship to the path of the club. That's the terms you should think about it in. Now, where this is important, well, where this is particularly important is understanding how to hit a draw, in particular a high draw, as opposed to a pull slice. So if Mike would demonstrate the mechanics of the biggest, highest draw shot, I'd like for him to demonstrate that in the simplest terms.
Well, the first thing I would do is have my weight further forward. The ball position would be back. That would make my center even further forward than just moving my weight a little bit forward. My club face would be aimed to the right.
Would that be in an open position or a closed position?
It
to
would
the
be
target?
open,
Okay.
as far right as I want to start this golf ball.
So you're putting that club face where you want the ball to start.
Yes,
Okay.
not where I want it to finish.
Okay. Now, when you swing back, okay, where's your weight going?
Staying forward.
Okay. Now, when you come down to hit the ball at impact, okay, is your club face to this white line open, square, or closed?
Open.
Open. Okay. But, Mike, to this path of the club, is the club face open, square, or closed?
Closed.
Closed. So the ball draws because the face is close to the path. The ball starts to the right because the face is open to the target. Now, this is how these guys, these great players, have learned to hit the ball so high in the air with the draw, because they're actually hitting the ball with the face open, okay, as opposed to closed. Where this is really important to you is that you may be hitting the ball with the face slightly open, but your balls are slicing. Why would they be slicing if the angle of the face is the same?
Point of tangency has to be behind the ball.
Very
Club's hitting
good.
across the golf ball.
Now, guys, I've got to say this. This is important for you to understand. You may be hitting the ball with the angle of the club face the same, say it's 5 degrees open, as the tour player hitting the high draw. Your face may be the same, with the same face angle, but his ball is drawing and yours is slicing. Now, the question is why is that? Okay, Mike, why is that?
It's because of where the point of tangency is. If your point of tangency, the center of your swing is forward of the golf ball with the face 5 degrees open, the club is swinging out at the ball long enough so you don't hit across and put side spin on it. If the club face is 5 degrees open and my center's back, the club's hitting at an angle across the golf ball, which is causing the ball to start side spinning to the right.
Very good. You said that well. So, Mike, when you hit this ball, if your face is 5 degrees open, the ball starts slightly to the right, like we said. The ball starts where the face is pointed, basically. But if your club is coming across the ball with that 5 degree open club face, which way does the ball go?
To the right.
Curse the dreaded slice. But now you take the tour player who has the exact same angle in degrees of the club face at impact, and you move the point of tangency forward. Now the path is going outward longer. You're hitting the ball on the back side of the circle with the exact same face angle, and what happens to the ball?
Hit a draw.
So what you need to understand is to hit the ball straight, keep the weight even with the ball. To make the ball push or draw, move the weight forward. That helps you swing outward. To make the ball pull or slice, intentionally or unintentionally, the weight would be back, making the club come across the ball.